You're listening to a broadcast of a previously recorded program.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Seaweed isn't just for sushi. It's found in everything from lotions and baby food to eco-friendly bioplastics. Seaweed farming is the fastest growing sector of American aquaculture. That's according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And Connecticut and other states across New England are riding the kelp wave. This hour, we'll hear from local kelp farmers and aquaculture experts. Joining me now is Susie Flores, who's the co-owner of Stonington Kelp Company. Susie, wonderful to have you on Where We Live today.
Thank you so much. So excited.
And also with us is Zach Gordon, who's an assistant extension educator for Connecticut Sea Grant. Zach, appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Eric Dawson, who's the Director of Program Innovation at Yellow Farmhouse Education Center in Stonington here in Connecticut. Eric, happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions on how to use kelp or what even is kelp. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Eric, I want to dive into this with you first. What exactly is Kelp Week and how is it celebrated across the state?
Yeah, so Kelp Week is a celebration of the sugar kelp industry in Connecticut. So there are a few different partnerships that happen during this week. So there's a lot of partnerships between kelp farms and local restaurants. There's a lot of education that's happening on kelp, whether that is adult cooking classes, student cooking classes, getting kelp directly into the classroom. And then there's a lot of awareness that happens around kelp. And this year, Kelp Harvest Week is happening from April 20th to around April 30th. But you can really sort of just extend it over the course of the month of April to create a kelp month. The Yellow Farmhouse where I work, we've been involved in Kelp Week since about 2022, where we were able to purchase about 250 pounds of kelp from Susie Flores to be able to distribute that to over 10 teachers across the state of Connecticut. It's really awesome.
That is really cool. I can't imagine being exposed to this as a kid. And Susie, I have to ask this. We've been talking about kelp. What does kelp taste like, and what does it look like?
Well, what we grow, so kelp is a term that encompasses about 30, maybe 35 different types of macroalgae. Mm-hmm. But it's a brown seaweed. We grow specifically sugar kelp, which is the only species of seaweed that you can legally grow in the state of Connecticut. And it has it's named sugar kelp because it has a higher amount of mannitol, which is a naturally occurring sugar in the tissue, but it is not sweet. It's actually an umami flavor. So you can, once it's blanched, it becomes pretty mild, but it can add this kind of glorious enhancement to whatever dish you're preparing.
Well, then talking about dishes, do you use kelp in your own cooking? And when did you start doing that, and how do you incorporate it into your meals?
I actually use it quite frequently in my own cooking. We use it as a seasoning, I'd say. If you've ever had kind of an everything but the bagel style seasoning, picture that, and then we just add a bunch of dried kelp to it. And that is something that my kids will eat on avocado toast. We put it on top of eggs, on top of rice. I put it on potatoes. I put it on everything. It's kind of a way to enhance flavor without having them dump salt all over their food, which is kind of the constant battle with my children in particular. We also add it to a lot of soups because it holds up very, very well in soups. And it's a really great way to kind of layer in additional vegetables, which are always a struggle to get enough of in my family.
Well, it's funny, when you were talking about what you use it for, I'm a big seaweed fan, grew up with a lot of it. I actually just found out one of my friends uses it as popcorn seasoning. Exactly. Yes. For the reason that you were talking about, to lessen the salt intake. I have not taken up on that yet, but I'm going to have to give it a shot after this. It's
quite good. And also on French fries.
Ooh, okay. Eric is nodding. What do you use seaweed, kelp in?
I haven't tried it as a popcorn seasoning yet, but that does sound really good. I'll normally add it if I'm making a soup like Susie does, and then if I have access to dried kelp, I'll mix it into a cookie dough batter, so I can substitute adding salt, get a little extra umami in there, and you also can see the little specks of kelp when you're biting into the cookie, which I think is really fun. And a kelp butter is really, really tasty.
There are so many things I need to try, and we're only like 4 minutes into this conversation. And Zach, I want to ask you if I see sugar kelp washed up on the Connecticut shore, which is it possible? / can I pick it up, wash it off, and eat it?
It is possible to see, but I would not recommend picking it up, washing it off, and eating it. So in Connecticut, we have very strict regulations about where we can grow it as farmers, and it's very specific to the highest level of water quality. So, and we harvest it at the right time as well, so that it's really good quality. So I would really only buy it from farmers. Yeah, so those areas you might find it washing up on the beach might not be as high water quality as where we're growing it.
Well, we were talking about food. Do you have a favorite food that you put seaweed or kelp on?
Well, so I did a kelp cooking class last year, and one of the things we made was a kelp mac and cheese, and that was kind of one of my favorite things. I thought it was, excellent, a little extra boost of flavor to the mac and cheese.
Well, Eric is nodding really hard at that. Go for it, Susie.
It is so good. He's not kidding. And I mean, they will, the place where Zach did the cooking class last year is in East Lyme, Connecticut. It's called Whitegate Farms. And it's like a prepared food sort of organic farm where you can order this macaroni and cheese and pick it up. And it serves maybe 4. And that's coming soon. I already called to see when I can get my hands on some. So just don't buy more than you actually need, please. Share some for everybody.
That's the kind of information we need. And Eric, your work with the Yellow Farmhouse involves educating the public about how they can use locally grown ingredients in their daily lives, like what we're doing right now. Yeah. So when you work with students, what surprises them most about kelp or seaweed?
I think one of the biggest things that surprises students is just like the versatility of the ingredient. So you can use it fresh, you can dry it, you can blanch it. When you blanch it, it turns from the sort of like golden amber color to this like super bright, vivid green. And the reaction is like basically instantaneous. So that's just like a fun science, like an edible science experiment for students. So I think that is a really cool way. It's also like makes the flavor a bit more mild. So you're not getting that like sometimes can be like overwhelmingly like salty flavor. So seeing what they can do with not only like the raw unprocessed kelp, but also like processed kelp in different ways. Really showing like how versatile it is. And yeah, just like the flavor is really good. So I think like once students can get over the fact that like, oh, we're eating this algae from the ocean, then they can actually like taste it and appreciate it for what it is. And yeah, that's just like really cool to see.
Well, I kind of love that because it's like opposite in the classroom where oftentimes we're asked to don't stick it in your mouth.
Yeah.
But you're actually doing this for science.
Yeah, 100%. Like as long as we can, our goal at like the Yellow Farmhouse, especially if we're working with crops that might not be familiar to folks, is just to make these ingredients, make their flavors as familiar to folks as possible. And then once they get like comfortable with that in like a familiar setting, then we see that they're more likely to like, sort of like branch out and try it in other ways.
I was just going to ask, do you think that adds to the students or the adults' curiosity?
That's sort of what we're going for. We want people to have more questions about it. We want people to care about kelp. So once people start like caring about something, they're more likely to want to like learn more and be more interested in like protecting it. So that can lead to like different like advocacy and stuff like that as well.
Well, listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or ask us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Susie, before the show, we spoke with David Stanridge, who's the executive chef of the Shipwright's Daughter in Mystic here in Connecticut. And he was on a previous episode of Where We Live. And at the time, we asked how he incorporates kelp into his dishes. And here's what he said.
Right out of the water is delicious just on its own. But we use it in everything from desserts, where we make a candied kelp or a kelp caramel, to entree preparations where we wrap fish in it and almost kind of substituted it for like how you would have wrap something in bacon, or smoked the kelp and then wrap a fish or pork in it. I use it as kind of a crispy wrapper. I deep fry it and top it as a crispy thing. It goes in pastas, soups, all kinds of different sauces. It's very versatile.
So, Susie, we've been talking earlier that food is maybe the most obvious use for sugar kelp, especially in the hands of a James Beard Award-winning chef. And we've mentioned mac and cheese, some broth, pastas, and even popcorn earlier. But what are some other ways that you find surprising to use kelp? What are some products that kelp is popping up in that people might not expect?
Well, one of the ways that seaweed has a really valuable application is actually in your soil. So at the end of our season, all of the farmers in the region are required, based on our permits, to pull the extra seaweed that we grew and couldn't sell for food out of the ocean. So you're left with, in some instances, like 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds of kelp that's no longer really at the point where it would be considered food grade, but still fantastically nutrient dense. And we know that it was grown in clean water, so it doesn't have any of like the icky stuff that you would find, I don't know, in less ideal waters. I don't want to knock any specific area, but
Sure.
so what you can do is what farmers are starting to do is dry that seaweed and grind it into, essentially just a kelp meal. And you can apply that to your soil. And it's a great soil amendment and an alternative to using chemical synthetic fertilizers in your soil. And it helps improve root development, soil structure. It can help with water retention, so you don't actually have to water your yard as much. So that was a really exciting application that I think it's going to be big in this region.
Well, and we've been focusing on kelp, but sort of using kelp and seaweed in a sort of interchangeable way. Is there a difference? What's the difference between seaweed versus kelp?
Kelp is a type of seaweed. In fact, sugar kelp is a type of kelp. So it's all under that big umbrella of seaweeds. But seaweeds are referring to, when we're talking about them, usually macroalgae.
And I think for many Asian countries like Japan or Nordic countries like Iceland, using kelp in food isn't uncommon. Are you seeing it becoming more common here?
Definitely in the region where we are, in the Stonington Mystic area. We have a lot of partners as well in Fairfield County who are starting to incorporate it more onto their menu. It's wild because it's something that is very sustainable. It's sustainably grown in this region. It actually improves the water, so it is absorbing nitrogen and pulling carbon out of the ocean every time we farm. So even if we're not selling it as a sustainable food to help feed our community, that alone, I think, brings a lot of value. And it doesn't put any pressure on resources. We don't need any fresh water to grow kelp. We don't need any arable land to grow kelp. So it's really quite a superhero all around. So when people kind of get that whole message, it's a lot to take in, all of the values that it brings.
Right.
When they kind of get that whole message, I think that they usually get on board. It's a lot of education, which is why partners like Yellow Farmhouse are so important.
Right, and did not expect so many uses for kelp. And Zach mentioned earlier that we have a lot of locally grown kelp here in Connecticut. So where exactly can we find them? Is it possible that I may be looking out at the ocean and seeing kelp farms without realizing that I'm looking at a kelp farm?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. There's not a lot that you see on the surface when you're out in the water on Long Island Sound. It's usually just the buoys. It may be a lot of buoys, but the best way to get kelp in Connecticut, I would think, would be to talk to the farmers themselves. A lot of them sell it directly to consumer, or at a farmer's market or things like that. But there's not a ton of people growing it in Long Island Sound, but it is getting more popular in the Northeast in general. Maine has a lot of farms, and there are some products from Maine that are kelp grown that you can find in your grocery stores.
You've been listening to Zach Gordon with Connecticut Sea Grant, Eric Dawson, Director of Program Innovation at Yellow Farmhouse Education Center, and Susie Flores, who's the co-owner of Stonington Kelp Company. They'll be staying with us after the break, a look at the kelp industry in Connecticut and across New England. Want to cook with kelp? Call our kelp line, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
following program was previously recorded.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. And did you know that seaweed farming is the fastest growing aquaculture industry in the U.S.? Today, we're exploring underwater kelp farms and why this sustainable food source is gaining in popularity. Still with me are aquaculture experts and kelp farmers, Susie Flores, Zach Gordon, and Eric Dawson. So, Susie, I want to jump back to you here. Tell us about the Stonington Kelp Company. How does a person become an ocean farmer?
Sure. Our farm we're actually going into our 8th harvest, which I kind of can't believe.
That's amazing.
My husband and I started the farm when we moved on to a marina that we started rehabbing, and we tried to figure out other ways that we could keep working on the water year round. So the season for seaweed farming is really over winter. So we're at the end of our season right now, whereas most farms are starting to ramp up. It was a labor of love. There's not really much of a seaweed market in southern New England. So we did a lot of cold calling, a lot of dragging chefs out to the seaweed farm so that they could see what we were doing. And that was a great strategy because they were a captive audience. Unless they wanted to jump off and swim back to shore, they had to sit and listen to me talk about all of the amazing things that seaweed can offer to their guests and all of the different ways that they could use it. And then we also just happen to live in a region where people really care about where their food comes from. And we have a lot of really creative chefs in this area. So it was a lot of luck, a lot of hard work, a lot of grit on my husband's part. He does quite literally the heavy lifting. He's in charge of all of the anchors and setting the gear and things like that.
Well done, husband. And I will say that when I first found out that there was Kelp Week here in Connecticut, it was really surprising in like the best way possible. Because like the nerdy side of me is like, that's cool. What is it? So it's fun. It's fun to be able to have that here. And as you sort of explore the kelp industry, when you started your farm, was there anything that surprised you?
I am surprised by how many kelp friends I've made. Zach mentioned earlier that it is a small but tight-knit community. So literally just last week, we were hosting kelp farmers from Alaska for 5 days who came out and helped us out on our farm, and we just exchanged ideas. And, they came to my daughter's chorus recital at her elementary school. So it's become a really wonderful way to kind of layer in additional people and joy in my life. That was something I wasn't expecting.
Right. Love some kelp friends. I mean, there's a reason why we're all sitting here today talking about this kelp friend circle. And Zach, you also grow your own kelp. How did that start?
Yeah, so I've been working in the aquaculture industry for the past 10 to 12 years in different states in the Northeast. And as I was doing that, I got really interested in starting my own thing. I've been talking to my dad for a long time. If I ever got a job in Connecticut or moved back to Connecticut where he lives, we'd try doing something together. So about 3 years ago when that happened, we said, okay, let's do this. Let's start a kelp farm. So it's me and my dad. This is our 3rd season. And it's just a really fun way for us to get on the water together in kind of the odd off season of the year during the winter, working together. And, it's for us, it's not really about the money. It's about the hobby of it and enjoying some time together on the water and doing something meaningful. So it's been really great.
Well, and you work with the Connecticut Sea Grant. Can you tell us what is that and what does your work entail there?
Yeah, so Connecticut Sea Grant is a program that is funded partially by the federal government and partially by the state government in Connecticut. We're housed at UConn, and we address issues on the Connecticut coast. So we do a lot in aquaculture, we do a lot in coastal education, sustainability, resilience of coastlines. So a lot of what we do is work with farmers, work with regulators, work with researchers, get them in kind of the same room talking about the issues that they're facing and how we can, for kelp farming, make it a more sustainable, more beneficial industry here in Connecticut.
Well, and Eric, Kelp Week was sort of your entry into working with the Yellow Farmhouse, right? And can you talk about the role that Yellow Farmhouse plays in the kelp industry? It feels like there's a thread between all three of you where it's kind of like, all right, this is interesting. I'm going to do it.
Yeah, for sure. So at the Yellow Farmhouse, we sort of see ourselves as like mainly like facilitators, so connecting the dots between kelp farmers and people who are interested in kelp. We're also Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. We're also educators, so we're educating folks about kelp wherever we can during Kelp Week and beyond. Advocates, we're always trying to promote more like advocacy for the kelp industry, not only through ourselves, but like through the education that we're doing, providing resources and materials for other folks to go out and advocate for the kelp industry. And then through a new grant that we have, Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grant, we're hoping to be more of like a partner within the kelp industry. So one of the major challenges is a lack of like middle of the supply chain infrastructure. So places where folks can like process, store, even just like freeze kelp for longer term use. We are going to be like a bigger partner in that with the construction of a commercial kitchen that we're getting built on the farm, a 40-foot refrigerated shipping container that's getting donated by Green Wave, another great organization. And yeah, we're just really trying to provide spaces where kelp farmers can store and process their things. So their crop can last longer and it can get out to more people.
Well, and then Susie, before getting to the processing and storage, we got to harvest the kelp. Can you talk about what that process is like? Is harvesting kelp ever dangerous? And what factors are you navigating when you are traveling to your farms out on the boat?
I think doing anything on the water always has its inherent dangers, but harvesting kelp shouldn't be dangerous because you learn that you have to just listen to the ocean. You're not going to win if you try to do something that isn't the wind and the tide is suggesting otherwise. Everybody harvests differently depending on what they're harvesting for. So at my farm, and most frequently in southern New England, people will harvest to order. So they tend to be smaller amounts that you're going out to harvest. And this can be done usually using a small winch or sometimes even just leaning over and grabbing the line which the seaweed's growing off of and slicing the kelp and putting it into the cooler or basket that you're bringing it back to shore on. Towards the end of the season, when we tend to harvest for soil amendment, we'll be harvesting larger quantities, and that sometimes can involve multiple boats. Sometimes we're using a barge. Sometimes we're, harvesting with the winch, filling up a brailer bag and then tossing it over the side of the boat. So it really depends on what the destination of the seaweed is. But the one thing that we never do, at least on my farm, is we never push it. There's, it'd be a silly reason to get hurt. So,
right. And I think you mentioned earlier, our Connecticut's water is good for growing kelp.
Yeah, absolutely. In the state of Connecticut, you're not allowed to set gear for a farm unless you are in an approved aquaculture site, which means the water quality is being monitored. Where we grow our sugar kelp, the water is cold, the water is clear, and we get a very strong current. There's a lot of turnover. Our farm is located basically at the very end of the Long Island Sound, so where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Long Island Sound, right near Stonington Harbor's commercial fishing port.
And of course, I imagine this depends on how much you want to grow, but do you need a lot of space to grow kelp?
You're correct. It depends on how much you want to grow. And as I mentioned before, you're responsible for everything that you grow on your farm site, and you're going to have to take it out of the ocean at the end of the season. So there is a bit of strategy that has to be employed when you're setting your farm in the November, in the earlier months. We farm on less space than our lease size. So we only grow at about 50% of what we have the capacity to grow. And there's also different structures in which you can set your farm up to increase your yield. So I'm really looking forward to the time that the market demand is big enough for us to kind of maximize.
Are you seeing a little bit more demand now that it's a bit more common, as we kind of were talking about earlier?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. Every year it gets a little bit bigger and a little bit better. And, it's really encouraging.
Well, and Zach, we had mentioned too that kelp, Susie had described earlier as it's super sustainable and very eco-friendly. Can you expound more on what does that mean? What does it mean that kelp can help clean the water or make the ocean more healthy, for example?
Yeah, so I kind of can just reiterate what Susie was saying, but basically, you don't need any arable land, you don't need fresh water, you don't need, carbon emissions of very much at all. I mean, your boat getting out to the farm is about it. It just a lot of the things in farming that you usually need that are unsustainable just don't exist with kelp farming. It's really I mean, it can get a little more complicated, but basically, you put the seeds out in the fall, you let them sit in the water, you don't add anything, you just give them the room to grow that they need, you give them the light that they need from the sun, and they grow and they suck nitrogen out of the water, they suck carbon out of the water. They really provide a lot of benefits. Even like, a lot of times you'll see fish around the farm, you'll see other organisms, and it's like a whole new ecosystem that you're kind of building out in the ocean for other things. So it's really beneficial in kind of a lot of those ways.
Well, are you seeing if climate change is impacting the industry or impacting how kelp is farmed or harvested?
Um, I wouldn't necessarily say. I mean, kelp is a cold water species, so as Long Island Sound warms up,
Hmm.
certainly it's going to be harder to grow. It's going to be harder to harvest, so that is more of a long-term impact.
Sure.
But really, the seasonality of kelp is really interesting. Like some years it grows really well, some years not so much, and it really depends a lot on the amount of nutrients that the water is getting. So it
Right.
is really kind of year to year dependent.
Right. So many moving factors here. And Eric, we are learning that kelp is good for the ocean, but how is it good for farmers too, especially during off season for fishers?
Yeah, for sure. So fishers in the region, like the winter season is often like less busy for a lot of them. So being able to get into farming can just provide like another stream of revenue for them at a time when they are not having as much revenue as other parts of the season. So yeah, I think, and another big part of that is like if you are a fisher, if you're like a fisherman, you already have like one of the major pieces of infrastructure to be able to start kelp farming with just like having a boat or access to a boat.
Right.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a great opportunity for like fishers to start getting into kelp farming. Yeah, for those exact reasons. Like their off season is sort of like the prime kelp growing season. They already have a lot of the infrastructure to be able to do that. And then Susie was mentioning earlier about like land-based farmers using kelp. So yeah, in the past, like people have picked up kelp from the beaches and spread that into their fields. That's been done for like millennia at this point, from like indigenous cultures up to like European colonizers coming in. And then yeah, in addition to that, like at the Yellow Farmhouse, I also run a small, it's called our micro farm. So we're working with Susie to be able to get sugar kelp, like her leftover kelp at the end of the season, and testing that out as a soil amendment for our farm as well. So I'm really excited about that project.
Well, then we were talking about earlier too that students, their curiosity kind of blossoms as they kind of experience kelp for the first time. Are you seeing a similar curiosity or interest from farmers who want to do that off-season work or just interested in learning more about how they can get into it?
I think so, for sure. I know that for part of like Susie's project, Yellow Farmhouse is a part of it, and I believe there's like two other farms who are also a part of this like kelp soil amendment test. And definitely, I could see like more folks who have farms along the coast. Like if this ends up like being like a really like viable amendment source for soil, it's going to be really easy for those farmers just to simply go down to the beach, pick up a bunch of kelp, and start like spreading that on their field. So it's like free fertilizer. It's like cleaning up the beach a little bit by getting some of that kelp off of there. Yeah, I'm hoping that it's going to turn into like a really productive thing and try to get us off of some of those like synthetic fertilizers and stuff.
Well, we're really looking forward to seeing that development. You've been listening to Eric Dawson, who's the Director of Program Innovation at Yellow Farmhouse Education Center, Susie Flores, who's co-owner of Stonington Kelp Company, and Zach Gordon, who is with the Connecticut Seed Grant. And after the break, what would it take to encourage more regenerative ocean farming in our state?
The following program was previously recorded.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The fastest growing aquaculture industry in the country is something most land dwellers know surprisingly little about. But seaweed, it turns out, is a sustainable food source as well as a natural ingredient in some beauty products and fertilizers. Still with us, three local leaders in the seaweed industry, Susie Flores, Zach Gordon, and Eric Dawson. And guess what? Our kelp lines are still open. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Zach, we've been talking a lot about farming kelp here in Connecticut. Can you talk about if there are any big challenges that they face here?
Yeah, I think there are a few. So one big thing that Eric mentioned is there's not a big infrastructure to process kelp. So towards the end of the season or when you want to harvest more or produce more kelp, you really only have a couple of hours before it starts going bad. So having that infrastructure that you can process into freezing it or blanching it or drying it and preserving it. And then with that, because it's such a new industry, the regulations around kelp can be daunting for some farmers, and there's a lot of questions about what can be done, what can't be done. So one of the projects we're working on is kind of working with regulators to come up with the regulations around how you can use kelp and what you can use it in. Because it has so many different end uses, there's a lot of different things you got to think about when regulating kelp.
And what are some of the things that I think maybe might come as a surprise for regulators that they now have to think about when it comes to kelp?
So there's the food safety aspect of it. So kelp, it's possible if it's not grown in the right area, or if there's certain water release of some kind. So they do testing, but there's a lot of food safety concerns around the heavy metals that might be included. So Connecticut does really extensive testing, and we're currently working with farmers to do even more rigorous testing to come up with limits on what should be allowable and what shouldn't be for food uses and then for other uses as well.
Well, and Susie, you do a little bit of both. You're a kelp farmer and a business owner. What do you find the most challenging about your work?
I think Zach kind of touched on it. Because it's a really new industry, there's not a lot of there's still a lot of questions from on the regulatory side. So when I'm trying to approach the business and make business decisions for the future, I have to kind of rely on, I have to accept a little bit of ambiguity in terms of how that regulatory process is going to shake out. And I have to kind of commend the state of Connecticut because they were really forward thinking. The first commercial farm was set up, or actually the first research farm where kelp was farmed was set up in Connecticut. So this state kind of started the whole thing, and they do the most. We are unique in the way that we approach food safety standards for seaweed, and we serve as a model, I think, for other states as they start to come along in the process as well. I didn't realize this was going to involve so much education. That I think was what threw me for the biggest loop. And that's why it was really great to find partners in the Yellow Farmhouse.
Well, and I was just going to jump straight back into education because you all had mentioned this earlier that there's a need for more public awareness and public education. So, Eric, with the Yellow Farmhouse, is public education surrounding kelp, including what it is, how to use it, where to find it, is it in need of a boost? What are your thoughts?
I definitely think there can always be more education about the topic. In the past, when Yellow Farmhouse has worked with schools or just been involved in public education events, when I've been doing presentations, I usually like to start off with the big picture of kelp. So talking about all of the environmental benefits and all the things that it does for just our waterways and our general ecosystem as a whole. So one of the things that I think surprises a lot of folks is just all the things that it does for the ecosystem, Susie and Zach have been saying. So it helps clean up the waterways. It provides habitat for other critters in the area, like fish and other things like that. In terms of, other educational things that we've worked with before, I think really just when it comes to working with students in particular, having new experiences and exciting experiences with kelp has been really important. So when I've delivered kelp to schools, it's usually me walking into the front office with a big cooler of kelp, and then a teacher and one of the students will normally meet me in the office, and I can hand that kelp over to them. But just the experience of having this new unfamiliar crop just show up in your classroom one day, and then your teacher says, we're going to cook with all of this, can be like a really fun experience for kids. It's something new, it's something unfamiliar. And then with like the lessons that we provided for all of those teachers, it's also giving them a good way to get more familiar with it. So our lessons really try to make it as easy as possible for the teachers to break down some of those like barriers and misconceptions about kelp. And then from there, they get to learn about it, have those misconceptions sort of broken down, and then directly cook with it over the course of like an hour and a half. So just all three of those steps happening in such a short, confined period of time, I think is really beneficial for getting a lot of information in and hopefully sparking a lot of passion as well.
I would love to be a part of those classrooms based on
it
your...
seems really fun.
I know, based on your description. And we've been talking about education, and especially with younger people and also farmers. And Zach mentioned earlier educating regulators and policymakers as well. Is there any way maybe someone doesn't have a farm, but they're interested in investing in logistics or infrastructure? Is that something that people can get into?
I don't know too many details about it, but I'm sure that there would be interest from farmers for having like investment. I'm sure Susie and Zach would probably have better answers for that. But yeah, I don't see why not. I think having more people involved in the industry is always a good thing.
Susie, did you want to jump in for that?
There's so many ways I think that people can invest in this industry, and all of them are very exciting. One of the things that's kind of tied to education that we've started doing, I found that when we can get people out to the farm, they become a lifelong kelp superfan. So we have started eco tours. So we're offering, folks to come out and experience the kelp harvest when we have, safe enough weather to do that. In fact, we're going to be running a tour after I get off the phone with you guys today. And so in a dream world, I would love a bigger electric motor boat that we could use to take large groups out, like, students, things like that, to just have everybody fall in love with what Zach and I and Eric, when he's come to the farm, what we all see and, absolutely adore. It's really magical when you're out there.
Yeah.
I can believe that. And I'm so jealous because I've shared before where I need a little Dramamine when I'm on the ocean, but I think I can get over that for kelp. So, and I want to take a quick moment here. We got a caller. Jeff is calling in from Coventry. He has a question about where he can buy kelp. Jeff, you are on the air.
Yeah, I want to know where I can buy it. How does it come? Is it only available dried, or, is it available frozen or even fresh? Just how do we get into this system? It sounds like a wonderful nutrient for all. It's just great all the way around. I'd like to hear about that.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for your call. Susie, go for it.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and it's kind of interesting because it ties into what how the kelp farmers are allowed to sell their crops at the end of the season. So directly, currently, you can purchase at least kelp from my farm at there's a place called the Diddy Bag in Mystic and Whitegate Farms, which is a farm stand in East Lyme, Connecticut. At both locations, you are getting it in its like fresh state. So it is not dehydrated. Drying it is very simple. If somebody wanted dried kelp to have kind of shelf stable and used as a seasoning, down the right, like 6 months from now, you can do that very quickly at home in your oven. But it helps all kelp farmers. If you go to your local seafood monger, wherever you locally would buy fresh fish, and ask them to carry domestic kelp, because without that demand, it's really difficult for us to get into these stores and have kind of a more direct pathway to a customer base. So please ask for, it's got to be domestic kelp. Most of the seaweed that people eat in the United States is imported. I'd say something probably 95% or higher.
Well, thank you so much for that question, Jeff. And we've got about 2 minutes left here, so I want to end with all of you sharing some final thoughts, starting with Zach. Any tips for our listeners on how to get involved in Kelp Week?
How to get involved in Kelp Week? Yeah, just go to the restaurants that have it, support, ask for it on menus. If you are in a seafood restaurant or seafood establishment, kind of like Susie was saying, ask for kelp, ask if it's local. It really helps us to see people wanting that local product. And yeah, if there are people interested in investing in the industry or in kelp, I would recommend talking to Susie, myself, and you can get connected to who you need to talk to do that.
Great. And all this information will be on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. Eric, final thoughts for listeners. What do you hope they take away from today's conversation?
I hope they get a little bit more excited to try kelp. And yeah, my final thing would just be to just try it. It could be your new favorite food. You just have to give it a shot first.
True story. Susie, final thoughts for our listeners today?
I would say definitely give it a shot. The kelp world is pretty delightful, so it brings people together.
Well, we love talking with our kelp friends today. You've been listening to Susie Flores, who's the co-owner of Stonington Kelp Company. Susie, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
You're also listening to Eric Dawson, who's a director of program innovation at Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. Eric, we appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
And Zach Gordon, who's assistant extension educator for Connecticut Sea Grant. Zach, thank you so much for your kelp.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
And if you enjoy listening to Where We Live, consider supporting us with a gift. It's your dollars to allow us to amplify the voices of Connecticut. So we thank you so much for that. Give us a call at 1-800-584-2788 to make a donation, or go online and give a gift there, ctpublic.org/donate. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening.